Hey everyone. I'm excited for the next interview. It's a guest well versed in these issues. Somebody I've been talking to for quite a while as a reporter on climate and energy. Joining us from Capitol Hill, Congressman Casten. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So first, let's address the political moment that we're in. A few things
no
have
idea what you're
happened
talking
recently. Don't know if anybody's aware. You're someone who called for President Biden to step aside in the race, not in the first wave, but a little bit later on. Now that has happened, and Vice President Harris has begun launching her campaign. Do you see potential daylight between her and the president on climate and energy, recalling that she had run to the left of him during the primaries in 2019, 2020 on fracking, on a number of issues? She excited the climate base a little bit more, let's just say, than Biden did.
So fundamentally, no, because if you look under the Biden White House, we passed the single biggest climate bill that was ever passed by any government in the history of the human species.
I
don't know what it would
totally
mean to be to the left of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, I would also say, tragically, prioritizing people's access to clean energy and clean energy has become a partisan thing. Mm-hmm. And so it makes me angry to say that, actually, giving a crap about leaving this world in a better place than we found it, and giving consumers access to cheap energy, right? Because at the end of the day, the IRA is primarily tax credits, right? No one is going to go out and get that 30% tax credit unless they're willing to put up the other 70% of the capital and earn a return for their investors on that. So all this is bringing cheap energy onto the grid. That's become partisan, and that there's a whole rich conversation there. But no, I don't fundamentally see why. I would, frankly, having passed a bill that on our math delivers about 40% of what's scientifically necessary, I hope we get the rest done, right? But no, I don't see a lot of daylight on there. And we'll be watching, obviously, closely with, how she staffs out her advisors and what have you. But let's keep winning.
Yep. What excites you and worries you about AI and our energy infrastructure today? We were talking a little bit backstage about how some of this is a little bit misunderstood by the public, by lawmakers, on how our energy system really works. But as a former clean tech exec, what excites and worries you about this new technology and the energy demands?
So I should first say that I have one of the wisest people I've ever met on energy is my former VP of engineering back when I was manufacturing little custom-built power plants. And he was a very crusty guy who grew up with a slide rule and was arguably 200 plus IQ type and all the warts that go with that. And he said to me at one point, every advance in technology gives us more precision and less knowledge. And it was this interesting observation, right? Because he's like, on my slide rule, I have to know the order of magnitude to answer the question. Now I get an engineer who comes to me and says, I've got the answer within 16 digits, and I don't know if it's millions or billions. And I think AI is in many ways just a continuation of that trend. We had built, in my utility days, it's basically AI. I was using Visual Basic in Microsoft. It was not nearly as big a data sets, but it was the same tools of let me grab data off the web, let me optimize, let me find relationships. And we used it to not only better predict our upcoming load than our customers were telling us their load was going to be, but we reduced our revenue variability by 90%. In other words, with a computer model just taking in weather data and economic data and all sorts of other stuff, we were doing a vastly better job than our customers were at telling us how much electricity, chilled water, steam they were going to use next year. That's awesome. I also have absolutely no idea what the fundamental relationships are that was pulling out, right? You're building all this in, you've got your weighting factors, but you're getting a tool that's very useful, which gives you a lot more precision, but there's less fundamental knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that does just at a philosophical level, that scares me a little bit because, I've run very analog utility plants with people who had unbelievable expertise in understanding that when that thing vibrates, I move this over here and that makes this thing work better. And now you've got a lot of computational skill that it never vibrates, but are we designing a system to anticipate all future variables, or are we designing a system that is correlations based on past history? And particularly in a climate changing world where things are changing very quickly, how do we manage that? I don't sweat, as we were talking backstage, I don't sweat too much about the load growth, only because we know that the path to decarbonize is to electrify everything, to massively build out the loads. We know that's paced by our ability to build clean energy and transmission quick enough to connect it all up. And AI is just a part of that larger story, which isn't to trivialize the challenge, right? But I don't think it's unique from, as the last speaker said, the rise of electric vehicles, bringing manufacturing back. We just got to do that in a responsible way.
And you're somebody who's been an enthusiastic proponent of permitting reform and building new transmission. What is your reaction to the new bill that dropped yesterday in the Senate, the Manchin-Barrasso Senate permitting reform bill, which has some of the transmission elements, the Big Wires Act, et cetera. I'm curious if that's something that you can throw your support behind, or at least looking at pretty seriously.
So there's pieces I like in it on as you mentioned, some of the transmission permitting stuff. Interregional is critical. Like, we do a really bad job in this country of building wires that are designed to lower the cost at nodes. We do a really bad job of building wires that will connect across the country. It's almost absurdly easy for Pepco to build a wire within their network that will connect two parts of the Pepco system for reliability reasons. It's absurdly difficult to build a wire from Chicago to Iowa that will bring cheap power from Iowa into the Chicago market. And where I think the Manchin bill misses something important is that one of the biggest challenges to transmission is that none of the people who have the ability to approve wires in this country have an economic incentive to lower the price of power. If you build out, a massive data center for one of your AI networks, and you want to put, a bunch of solar on the roof of that facility, and maybe you're gonna put even more than you can because you can make so much money because the price is so high, you want to export to the grid. You are going to get into a fight with your utility about that. The joke I shared with you backstage is that getting permission from a utility to interconnect with their grid is like getting permission from a man to date his wife. You might well be better and in the public interest for you to change up here, but you're not going to get that approval without a lot of fight. And what the Manchin-Barrasso bill doesn't do, that Mike Levin and I's bill does, is say, if you get the profit signals right, the permitting problems are easy. If you don't get the profit signals right, you're stuck with all these top-down mandates. And so one of the things that I think is sort of key to what Mike and I have been trying to do, and and we'll see where the Senate bill goes, we'll try to push this in, is let's change the way that rates are done. Right now, you get a guaranteed return on capital if you're a regulated utility for the capital you deploy, and in theory, your operating costs are pass-throughs. We could change those rules. We could go through and say, if you're helping your state meet their renewable energy goals, if you're decarbonizing, if you're lowering the congestion prices on the nodes on your system, we'll give you a little bit higher return on equity. Let's get you aligned with your customers instead of fighting with them. There are places that have done that in the country, and it's worked really well. We know how to do it. We need to do that nationally. And I think the Manchin-Barrasso bill is a good start on the transmission side. I think the oil and gas stuff is goofy. That's how you get a West Virginia senator and Barrasso to agree to put it forward. But it's a good, it's a marker, it's a start.
Yeah. Something that I've kind of had as a pet issue as a journalist writing about, and something that you're interested in, you've lamented the lack of the Office of Technology Assessment in today's Congress. and co-sponsored a bill to reestablish and improve it. Now, you can describe what the entity was and why it was eliminated or when in 1995, but do you think it would play a key role in educating lawmakers more on AI? I mean, do you find that education piece critical at this point?
I'll tell you, it is not only lawmakers. And we got to run the dates here in this personal history. So in 95, the OTA gets eliminated. I get out of grad school in 98 and go to work at Arthur D. Little doing technology consulting. And one of the first jobs I had was BP hired us because they were going to rebrand themselves as Beyond Petroleum.
Yep.
And so we were to evaluate every possible zero carbon fuel chain that they could get into, the well-to-wheels costing, emissions, blah, 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 blah. They did similar stuff. And as I would go to our library, which at the time was an analog library, there were all these OTA reports that if I wanted to know how does a gasifier work, how do you make dimethyl ether, there were all of these rich studies that we could go through, and then I would show up in a meeting and be the smart guy who just got out of grad school, but somehow he seems to know about how all these technologies work. And I said to my boss, how come there's nothing in the library after 95? And he said, because Gingrich eliminated the office. And I said, that's a bummer. And he was like, it's not that bad because now people pay us to do things that they used to get for free from the government. Right? And it was wonderful for the technology consulting world. But now you've got and again, not just members of Congress, but the public at large. You want to understand how these technologies work. And the OTAs, what they turned out, it wasn't just that it was accurate, but it was accurate in a way that a layperson could understand. How does this work? You don't have to have a master's in biochemical engineering to understand this stuff, right? And getting rid of that office was a conscious desire to be dumb. Period, full stop. I think it's the curse of Newt Gingrich. He made us dumber. And we need that back, but for members of Congress as well. I mean, I've had conversations with Republican friends across the aisle who want to do something on climate, who have lamented that if somebody who really understands climate and energy and the nexus of those and the technologies comes to the Hill, they don't waste their time going to meetings with Republicans because it's just not productive. And what this colleague shared with me is he's like, I'm trying to figure out how to make it okay for those conversations to happen. Well, a start would be if you could just you don't have to tell Mike Johnson that you're going to go to the library and read this report, right? It's like having books about, different gender identity in the library. Talk about this before you want to come out, right? And it's just hard that stuff isn't there right now.
Yeah. The OTA reports was something that I used to use as a journalist as well. Do you think the AI's power aspects, the power demand aspects, are at all changing the conversation about at least reforming transmission issues among your Republican colleagues?
So the challenge with transmission, and I want to put this in a non-democratic Republican way, although coincidentally it has some overlap, but I truly think that's just a coincidence. If you were to, let me give you a number. The US generates about $200 of GDP for every million BTUs of primary energy we use. It's a nerd number, but think of that as our energy productivity. We have labor productivity, capital productivity, that's our energy productivity. The UK generates about 360, almost twice as many dollars per unit of energy as we do. Switzerland generates 600. And broadly speaking, if you look at countries that are not resource rich, fossil energy resource rich to countries that are not made conscious decisions to make the most out of the resources they have. The US has always had an energy policy that has been focused on the interests of energy producers and only occasionally made policy choices to benefit consumers. Now, I say all that because now let's suppose that you want to build a transmission wire that's going to connect that cheap Iowa wind to my region in Chicago. That is an immediate threat to a utility who's making money at $70 a megawatt hour. It's an immediate threat to someone who was mining coal to bring that up to that plant. It's an immediate threat to, a gas fracking well that was bringing gas up, because all of a sudden you bring that cheap wind in, none of those other assets are going to operate. It is a massive benefit to consumers, right? And what that means, and the reason why I give the international numbers, is that if you could conceivably, with existing technology, double US GDP with no increase in energy use, which is essentially what those numbers suggest, that would arguably be the biggest wealth transfer in the history of our country, and it would be a wealth transfer from underpopulated energy producing regions to populated energy consuming regions. Coincidentally, that's red America to blue America, right? And so that creates a political problem. I remember having a conversation with Garrett Graves at one point that his district in Louisiana has issues that are politically not that different from Iran. If you really embraced cheap energy, he'd be surrounded by lots of unemployed young men, and that's a political risk. Right? Garrett's comment at the time was, I don't like being compared to the Ayatollah. I'm not comparing you to the Ayatollah, but I'm sympathetic to that challenge, right? And so how do we get that done? And so transmission is this enormous opportunity for consumers, transmission reform, but it's also a huge wealth transfer. And what I'm sort of hoping, and we were very intentional in the IRA of, number one, expanding the definition of environmental justice communities to include those communities that are going to be left behind in the transition, and making sure that we preferentially invest in those communities. So the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene now has a battery manufacturing producer in her district, that's intentional, right? And the hope is that as we go out, there's the Iowa delegation that we keep coming back to is all Republican. The Iowa economy depends a lot on ethanol and wind, right? It is not an economy that depends on fracking. At some point, that's in their interest to say, well, I want to go and push this through. I don't think we're there yet, but look where the leadership of the Republican Party is from right now. Mitch McConnell's from coal country. Mike Johnson's from the oil and gas. Kevin McCarthy was from Bakersfield. There needs to be a turnover in leadership in the Republican Party to get to that point where we put consumers first.
Well, this is all fascinating. You always bring considerable brain power and experience on these issues, so I thank you for being here. I'm being told to wrap up, but hopefully we'll have you back here again soon.
Thank you, Andrew. For sure.
All right, thanks. Thanks.